Welcome, everybody. I'm happy to welcome you to History Author Talks, and I'm very pleased that we have a number of distinguished authors with us this evening. And I also am very proud to announce that our partner in history this evening will be the Sons of the American Revolution. We'll get to that in just a moment. A few little housekeeping things. My name is Roger Williams. I am the producer of History Author Talks. You won't see me much through the show. I will be in the background. And what I'm going to be doing is answering or accepting everybody's questions using the chat feature. So if you want to look at the bottom of your screen, perhaps run your cursor down to the bottom of the screen and find the little chat feature. That is how you will send your questions to me for the guests. So all of your questions will come to me, and I will format the questions and send them to our guest host, who I will introduce in just a minute. I will also, during the show, I will also be sending everybody certain links. Primarily, I will be sending a link to bookshop.org. Bookshop.org has the listing for our book of the evening, Revolutionary Prophecies, which is what we're going to be talking about. It also has other books by all of our authors who are online tonight with us. And I wanted to let you know that the proceeds from bookshop.org are going to be contributed to the SAR Education Center and Museum, which our partner in history, Joe Dooley, will tell you about in just a few minutes. So we have pretty much everybody here while I've been chatting, and our guests are here. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you the president of the SAR Foundation, Mr. Joe Dooley. Joe, over to you.
Thank you, Roger. I really appreciate this. I want to thank Roger for allowing all the proceeds from the sales of any books tonight to go to the benefit of the SAR Education Center and Museum. We are presently trying to build this out in downtown Louisville, right within the footprint of Fort Nelson, which of course was built during the Revolution. I recently, for the SAR Education Center and Museum, a very generous donor, a man named Stan Harrell down in Tampa, Florida, donated a 1791 edition of Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. So this is a very significant addition to our collection, and we're very happy about that. The book that we're going to be discussing tonight is the result of papers that were delivered at one of the SAR annual conferences on the American Revolution. The SAR has a congressional charter which enjoins us to be an educational organization, and the SAR annual conference is our outreach to the university level study of the American Revolution. So we have these annual conferences, and ideally we not only have a great conference every year, but the papers presented at each conference result in what is called an edited volume. That is, they are peer reviewed and then published by an academic press. Revolutionary Prophecies, the Founders on the Future of America, is a result of the 2013 SAR annual conference, for which Rob McDonald served as the SAR Distinguished Scholar. That is to say, he was the academic facilitator. I will tell you, Rob has been the SAR Distinguished Scholar for 4 SAR annual conferences, and it's always a joy to work with him, as it is a joy to work with Peter. Roger, over to you.
Very good. All right. Be back to me in a second here. It's, the buttons seem to have changed on Zoom, so I'm going to make sure I'm trying to hit the right button there. There we go. All right. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that. And it's now my pleasure to introduce you to our guest host this evening, James Kirby Martin. Jim Martin is an award-winning author and editor of several books and numerous scholarly articles. His current research interests focus on military, social, and political aspects of early American history. Jim's current writing projects include a study of George Washington and political power built around the story of the Newburgh Conspiracy. Jim was named the James Reese Research Fellow at the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington in 2013-2014, and will also be an honoree at the next SAR conference, annual conference of the American Revolution. Full disclosure, to give you an idea of Jim's range of talent, Jim has also co-authored a novel that I will be publishing under one of my imprints this year called Surviving Dresden. That's a novel about life and death and redemption in World War II. And there's nothing like a good, thoughtful read and while learning history on the side. So I'm pleased to introduce my friend, James Kirby Martin.
Thank you very much. Oh, there I am. The host has spotlighted your video for everyone, so I understand that because my sound is on, right? You can all hear me.
Yes, your sound is on.
It says it's on. Well, anyway, welcome everyone. It's my delight to be with you this evening. I think we have a very, very interesting subject to look into, and we have two very distinguished historian authors that will be making presentations built around this book, Revolutionary Prophecies. And we've gotten a little bit of background information from that from Roger and Joe. And so what I want, my job is to have the pleasure of introducing these two author editors. And so we'll begin with Rob McDonald. I just want to give you a little bit of background information about Rob. He's had a very eminent career. He's currently a professor of history at the United States Military Academy. We all know where that is in West Point. And he is the author of many books, but I guess the one I want to point to is Founding Father, Thomas Jefferson's Image in His Own Time. And he's also been editor of several collections of essays. And these include Thomas Jefferson's Lives, Biographers, and The Battle for History. He's a co-editor of the book that we're going to discuss tonight. And like you, I'm waiting to hear. I want to learn more about Revolutionary Prophecies. So Rob, the floor belongs to you.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for agreeing to guest host this. Roger, thanks for having us. Joe, thanks for all of your support through the Sons of the American Revolution. And Peter Onuf, thank you for being my mentor and co-editor in this great project. It's been such a pleasure to be able to work with all of you. But the person I also want to thank is the person to whom our volume is dedicated, and his name is Lance Banning. Lance Banning was a professor at the University of Kentucky. He was a friend to me and to Peter and to so many people in the historical profession before he passed away. And we every year try to make the SAR conference a tribute to someone. Sometimes people who are still with us, other times people who we are, doing it in memory of. And it struck me that to honor Lance Banning, who built his career around the concept of republicanism. And republicanism, is essentially this idea that the American revolutionaries saw themselves as actors on the long stage of history, that they viewed themselves as being part of a long tradition. I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on. Alexa is speaking to me. I hope you can't hear her. If you can, you could laugh because it would be really funny. But the revolutionaries saw themselves as actors on the broad and long stage of history. They saw themselves performing acts that linked them with antiquity, that linked them with the period that had gone past, and that would allow them to connect to the future And so it's not a surprise that one of the mottos that they came up with for the United States of America was Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order for the ages. They were projecting, their memories backward, but they were also considering how people in the future would view them and how their actions would affect the future. So they're really in a dialogue with the past as well as with the future. And so they're very history minded, and they're mindful of themselves as actors on the stage of history. And so this conference, which results in this book, tried to cast a broad net. Now, most of the participants were students or friends of Lance Banning, and we wanted to give them some latitude in shaping the chapters that they wrote. But fortunately, they came up with a great number of different topics related to Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, George Washington, agrarian rebels like Shays's Rebellion or the Whiskey Rebellion, Native Americans, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Monroe, and Peter wrote an outstanding chapter, which he's going to talk to us a little bit more about, related to Isaiah Thomas, the printer and founder of the American Antiquarian Society. They had hopes for the future, but they also had real anxieties. And, in the extended moment of the early American Republic, they had anxieties about the Union and its ability to endure. They had anxieties about democracy. They had anxieties about the lack of democracy that they saw around them. They certainly had anxieties about slavery, and they worried too about the American character and whether Americans would, be able to sustain this bold experiment in self-government. But they also had hope, and we begin our volume with a quotation from Thomas Jefferson from the very end of his life. Jefferson, of course, lived a long life. He had seen all of these events transpire. He had lived through not only the Stamp Act crisis, but also the Missouri crisis. He had known Benjamin Franklin. He knew these players in history. And I think he was appreciative too of how people oftentimes saw the present in terms of the past. I'm thinking maybe in particular about Paul Douglas Newman's great chapter on the agrarian founders, 3 rebellions as legitimate opposition, where he writes about Shays's Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion and Freeze Rebellion. And, it just strikes me if you were, say, a whiskey rebel in Western Pennsylvania, and you, when the whiskey tax was passed, had absolutely no members of Congress from Western or Central Pennsylvania, because back in the first 2/3 of the 1790s, Pennsylvania actually elected its congressmen at large. So all the congressmen in the first Congress were from Philadelphia or the area immediately surrounding it. And this, whiskey tax is imposed upon you. And it's an incredibly onerous tax. It allows office holders, appointees of the Treasury Department to come onto your property, to search your house, to search your barn, to search your outbuildings, to measure your still, to assess this tax. Anyway, there are a lot of legitimate, I think, complaints about this. But one complaint that they had was that this was taxation without representation. And they essentially thought that this was Revolution 2.0, and that they were revolutionary reenactors who were standing up for their rights and putting this new brazen government on notice. Meanwhile, of course, in Philadelphia is the nation's capital. George Washington is president. Hamilton, of course, is the Treasury Secretary. And among the things that caused them to argue for this new constitution in the first place is Shays's Rebellion. This tax revolt and uprising in Western Massachusetts. And it is something that is a cause of the Constitution. It's one of the reasons that people gave for creating a government that they believed would be powerful enough to enforce the rule of law, and in so doing, protect people's liberty. So all of these people believe that they're, in dialogue with the past, and they're thinking about the past, but they're thinking about different pasts. So anyway, Jefferson had lived through all of this, but in his last days, he's thinking about America's revolutionary future. He receives an invitation from the mayor of Washington, D.C., which by that point was the nation's capital, Roger Waitman. And Jefferson at this point is 83 years old. He's desperately ill. When he responds on June 24th, his life spanned 83 years into the past and only 10 days into the future. So he's too sick to attend the celebration in Washington that Waitman invites him to celebrate the 50th anniversary of American independence. But reflecting upon the Declaration, Jefferson wrote, "May it be to the world what I believe it will be, to some part sooner, to others later, but finally to all, the signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which Mocha's superstition and ignorance had persuaded them to bind themselves, and to assume the blessings and security of self-government. That form which we have substituted restores the free right to the unbounded exercise of reason and freedom of opinion. All eyes are opened or opening to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of truth, the general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. These, he said, are grounds of hope for others. For ourselves, let the annual return of this day forever refresh our recollections of these rights and an undiminished devotion to them." So there is anxiety, there is worry in the early republic, just as we have anxieties in the present, just as we have worries, just as we have concerns about race relations and union and democracy. But there's also a good deal of hope. And I think that gives us hope as well. Thanks very much, Jim.
Now I have to unmute myself, and that's actually very interesting. And I hope you folks out there are thinking about questions you want to raise or comments that you want to make. We want to encourage you to do that, and maybe take some notes along the way. And now we're going to switch over to Peter Onuf, who has been the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Professor, now Emeritus at the University of Virginia. I don't know whether I'm Emeritus, by the way, too. So it's sort of like going from kind of distinguished to extinguished. We could describe it that. But I know that Peter's still very active. I try to remain active too. And he has an amazing career. Can't say enough about his accomplishments. He has taught at various schools, including Columbia, the Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and even Southern Methodist University, before joining the faculty at the University of Virginia in 1990. He's an author of several books. The first group of books more or less focusing on federalism and territorial expansion. And then there's another round of very important books dealing with Thomas Jefferson's political thought. One of those would be Jefferson's Empire, the Language of American Nationhood, published by University Press of Virginia in 2000. Another would be a joint work that he did with Annette Gordon Reed, recently published, Most Blessed of Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of the Imagination, published in 2016. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Emeritus Peter Onuf.
Jim, thanks very much. I'm here, full screen.
Good.
And
Okay.
it's nice to be here and with Joe and Jim and my good friend, Rob McDonald. And this book is very important to us. It's been in the works for a long time. And it's helped us think about the importance of history, because this is what we were asking of our subjects, from Thomas Jefferson to Isaiah Thomas and a lot of other people in between. Why was history important to them? We like to think of them as having original intentions, of having a vision of our future. We like to think, as Rob was reading from that wonderful Jefferson letter close to his death, that history has an arc and a direction and an end, and maybe we are the culmination of that great history. What we need to do is what Rob suggested we need to do, and that is to try to recapture that sense of anxiety and dread of this experiment in Republican self-government. Would it necessarily succeed? Were we good enough for this republic? Rob and Jefferson were talking about this idea of the mass of people not submitting to the tyranny of a ruling class or monarchs. Well, that notion of a mass of the people, they're not made to be beasts of burden. But what does he mean by a mass of the people? He means that the people somehow constitute a whole, that they have something in common with each other. And if the revolutionaries knew anything about the world they lived in 1776, it was that their fellow Americans didn't agree with them about very much. They came from different places with different economic interests, a different reliance on the institution of slavery. Their history was a history of being British subjects. And in a highly competitive world, full of anxiety, the notion that you could proclaim yourself an independent nation or country is, on the face of it, absurd and ridiculous. It is a bold experiment. They knew they could fail, and they failed periodically. They failed in the American Civil War. The whole Union fell apart. Yet they had a determination to create, to aspire to something. When we talk about prophecies, I think we're really talking about aspirations. You might even say we're talking about prayers. The prayer that we can do this, that we can trust each other enough. And if we remember that the war, the Declaration of Independence, was made in the middle of a war, we understand that violence is the context, a war in which Americans are struggling against each other. Many Americans, John Adams thought a third of all Americans were loyalists, maybe a third were neutrals, or maybe many of them, and this is the great anxiety in American history to this very day, were fellow travelers or fair weather friends. Which way is the wind blowing? Those kinds of anxieties are chronic. It's what we live with. And this is really what we share with the founders. Isaiah Thomas was a printer and a publisher, the founder of the American Antiquarian Society. That institution, and it's a peculiar name to us now, we think of antiquarians, we think of antiquities or antiques, we think of old, worthless stuff that only crazy collectors care about. But Thomas had a vision, or I should say, anxious vision, that in 1812, and you students of American history, and I know all of you out there know all about this, this is the war that you know when it happened because it's called the War of 1812. It's threatening the future of the Union. Would the Union be able to survive in the Second War for American independence? And what Thomas saw as the compelling thing was to create a shared history. For him, the antiquarian enterprise was not to find ancient relics of the classical world. It was instead that we desperately needed to remember everything that everybody did because it was a people's revolution. Thomas Jefferson was a great visionary, imagined democracy. We could say he invented democracy if we want. He had grand ideas. He had great hopes that the American people could rise to the occasion. But who were they exactly? And how would they know themselves? You can't know yourself if you don't have a history that's shared. What Thomas really experienced as a printer was being on the front lines of creating that climate of public opinion and what we call the print public sphere, in which everybody all of a sudden understood that there was a decision that had to be made. Either we were going to fight, either you were going to make the decision for independence or not. And it was a grand thing that people like Jefferson and George Washington stepped up to the occasion and took the lead. But it was an even grander thing that the people declared themselves independent. Jefferson said, I didn't write the Declaration of Independence. I was merely channeling the people. I put into words what they were thinking, the common sense and sentiments of their day. And it was that sense, in a sense that wasn't just an abstract idea, but it was a sense that provoked them to make the decision to take up arms, to defend themselves, and to create a better world for their children. The record of that decision, the records of all those decisions, history they were making, needed to be preserved. And that's what the Antiquarian Society was supposed to do. One of the reasons he located in Worcester, an inland town in Massachusetts, was the fear that the British might invade Boston, and fire was the great hazard of the day. We couldn't let these precious records be destroyed. They must survive, because in these records, and this is an ongoing story, it's what we do from day to day that determines the future of the Republic. Collecting these records, the newspapers, the sort of things that Isaiah Thomas printed, collecting them and preserving so that future generations would be able to connect themselves to that founding moment, would understand their own responsibilities to those who came after them. This was the view of Jefferson and Isaiah Thomas and all the other patriots who combined to commit themselves to the revolution. And that was, in that collective action, they could preserve the possibility of the fulfillment of the human prospect. This could be not just an enlightenment for the elite, the highly educated. It could be every man's enlightenment. But that light will only shine if our memory, collective memory, our history, the things that tell us who we are cherished. Not so that we worship our ancestors, but so that we recognize our own responsibility to future generations. Collecting antiquities, collecting newspapers was a patriotic imperative in a time of crisis. We too now are thinking back to history, and as we arrived in 2020 and 2021 with the publication of this book, Rob and I both said to each other, well, this is a timely book. Who knew? We thought, well, it took 7 years. Well, 7 years to produce a book that speaks to this moment, to tell us what we as historians need to do and what we as citizens need to do to better understand the world that we live in and our hopes for the future. Thanks, Jim.
Jim, you got to unmute.
I think I'm unmuted right now.
You are now. Yep.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much to our two authors, to Peter and to Rob. And we do have two questions, and I've got to open the chat room here. Actually, we have one question. So I have
more coming.
I'm looking for it. Okay, and this is a question. How much did place, that is north, south, west, and east, and or generation founding versus Applebee's first, affect the prophecies?
Well, we could both answer that. In fact, we could spend the rest of the time talking about that. Place is very important. I indicated that in passing. And also generational identity. One of the key things, and Rob said this, is that we have a multiplicity of histories. The challenge is for us to bring those histories together and to create a common history, yet that's always at risk. Joyce Appleby's wonderful book about the next generation focuses on precisely that problem of that passage from over time, space and time, coming from different places, having different experiences. For farmers in Western Pennsylvania that Rob was talking about, they're worried about their very subsistence. They worry about taxes that might destroy them, destroy their property. So the revolution for them continues. It's now. They see the possibility that the very thing they fought in the revolution could raise its ugly head yet again with an overpowerful central government taking their liberty away from them. That libertarian strain is very powerful from the beginning. I think you cannot overestimate the degree of diversity and conflict in revolutionary America. I like to say that the revolution is not really over until the Peace of Ghent, until the end of the War of 1812. And then the next thing you know, you've got the crises that lead to the Civil War.
I would add only that I love Joyce Appleby's book, Inheriting the Revolution. And it strikes me that it is based on memoirs. It's this first generation born after the revolutionary generation. And one of the things that Joyce was able to do was to find all of these different memoirs where regular people are telling their life stories. And it's so striking because, you know, we think of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography as the first of that genre. And maybe indeed it was. We have a fantastic chapter on it by the late Robert Ferguson in our collection. And, you know, Ferguson argues, meant to sort of inspire people to believe that, you know, if he could do it, this obscure guy from this obscure place who shows up in Philadelphia and, you know, mistakenly orders a bunch of rolls and carries them down the street feeling like he's ridiculous looking and completely out of place. If he could rise to become Mr. Philadelphia, the man of Philadelphia, and then, you know, this great man of the empire, if Ben Franklin can do it, then so can everybody else. And what's so amazing is everybody else seemed to believe him because they wanted to tell their stories and they believed that their stories were worth telling. So there really was, I think, this great kind of democratic impulse that was unleashed by the American Revolution. It elevated not only this government called the United States, but I think it also elevated the people of America.
Right now, I'm looking for questions from the participants, the audience. I don't see any, so.
Oh, I can throw one in here, Jim.
Okay, I've got one too, but you go.
Okay, since they're joined in history, could you compare the respective prophecies of Hamilton and Burr? Rob, why don't we start with you on this one?
Well, you know, the question is half easy and half difficult because we have a chapter written by Todd Estes about Alexander Hamilton, and his prophecy was that you know, democracy was dangerous, that, you know, federalism was on the decline, and he essentially wanted to make America safe for democracy by co-opting democracy, by using democratic means to promote the Federalist political alliance. And, you know, unfortunately for the Federalists, Hamilton's life was cut short by Aaron Burr before he was able to fully implement that vision. But Burr, that's a much more difficult question. We don't have a chapter on Aaron Burr, but as a good student, I always like to give the tough questions to my professor. So I'll turn this over to Peter Onuf.
Oh, Rob, you're such a good friend. You were a good student once, but what happened to you? Well, I think the Burr actually illustrates the previous question to some extent, and that is that sense of contingency. Anything could happen. Burr almost was president by the failure of the founders to be clear about the Electoral College. And of course, there was the infamous tie, a great constitutional failure. You think of the brilliant original intentions of the framers, but they got that one wrong. The Burr-Jefferson crisis didn't have to happen. They screwed it up. What Burr could have been president, but it would have been a stolen presidency, wouldn't it have? Because the people clearly thought that they were voting for Jefferson. Well, would Jefferson have won without the Electoral College distorting the vote and giving Southern states a 3/5 advantage from the enslaved people of the South, the counting of the votes. If we're quarreling about the Electoral College today, believe me, we've been doing it throughout American history. But Burr, as partly because of the disgrace of the duel with Hamilton, it was not clear that Burr could survive politically or even avoid punishment for a while. It wasn't clear. But Burr had an amazing, ambitious guy who we don't know exactly what he planned to do, but he went west, young man, and he organized what's known as the Burr Conspiracy. What kind of conspiracy? Toward what end? Did he really think that the Western states might secede from the Union? Was he on his way to Mexico? The Burr story is really important to us because it shows us how fragile the Union was, that a major politician like Aaron Burr could consider the prospect of dividing the Union. Well, that was the fear from the very beginning, and it would take place across regional lines. One of the things that Rob was talking about, we talk about the democratic potential if every man could make his own history and be part of this thing. Well, the people are the great hope, but the people, of course, also generate great anxiety because the people historically are known to be so easily misled. Our modern day concerns about populism echo the concerns of the founders about demagoguery, about the mob run wild, about those whiskey rebels Rob was talking about. From the perspective of Philadelphians, this is the end of everything. Westerners refusing to pay taxes, perhaps seceding from Pennsylvania, creating a new state, or leaving the Union altogether. The revolution was not settled until the antebellum period, until after the War of 1812 and beyond. And in that period of unsettlement, anything could have happened. One of the reasons why we talk about, our Americans have talked about manifest destiny and providential hand of God, and somehow this was intended to be, it's because it shouldn't have happened and they knew it. The only explanation for the survival of the Union in any form was that God must be on our side because we aren't. Anyway, Aaron Burr is the great test of early American democracy and the Union. At least the perception of Burr is the arch villain. Nancy Eisenberg, a good friend of ours, has written a wonderful book about Burr, defending him and suggesting that his reputation as the evil man is vastly exaggerated, that he was a great politician. In some ways, he was innovative, just the way, as Rob says, and Todd Estes say, Hamilton learned to use democratic means. Well, Aaron Burr was even better. In fact, Aaron Burr made it possible for the Republicans to win that election in 1800 because of what he did in New York, doing people's politics on the ground, in the streets. It's a complicated story. They knew it. We need to know it so we can get a better perspective on the complexities of our own time.
Jim, back to you.
Righty. Let me ask a question. And what I'm going to try to do here is to sort of pick up on what Peter was talking about, and that is anxiety in relation to people in power. And that is the question of, could people be trusted? That is a fundamental question that runs through the Revolutionary period, and you have a real divide in the population. I'll give you two examples. This is not meant to be a lecture. It's just turn into a question, hopefully. And that is that on the one hand, you have the John Adams types, think about his disquisition on government, and it's all about not trusting the people, basically, that really you have to have an aristocracy, an elite of certain sort, be in charge of government and society. And then compare that with the Thomas Paine type. And Thomas Paine says, let's open it up. We can trust the people. They're completely trustworthy. Then it relates to the matter of virtue. Are the people fundamentally virtuous? It gets back to the fundamental issue of the character of the natural nature of, it's a poor way to put it, but I think you can hopefully catch my drift. How do you respond to that? Did you feel a lot of that in all of these statements about anxiety? That was really about, could we trust the people?
Yeah, absolutely, Jim. I can't be brief. It's constitutionally impossible. I'll really try to set it up for my good friend Rob. I think of a lot of it, and I'd like to turn it back to you too, but you're not supposed to talk too much.
That's right.
As a military historian, I think you're looking right at the problem. And there are two ways to think about mobilization in the American Revolutionary period. And I think that's a key word. You don't have a country if you can't get the people behind you. They have to be stirred up. Yet, how do you contain and control the people once you've stirred them up? This is why some Whigs, before the Declaration of Independence, don't make the final step toward independence because they fear that all hell will break loose. The answer, and it's a paradoxical answer, is that you need the kind of discipline that George Washington, the Continental Army, provided, that for all its weaknesses and failures, the Congress provided. You need to contain this thing. What is it that you need to contain? Are the people a beast, as Gouverneur Morris allegedly said, or is this energy? It has to be controlled and contained in some way. I don't think, in some ways, that problem has ever gone away. On the one hand, Jefferson will tell you the people, the mass, the common folks who refuse to be abused and tyrannized, they are our future, and they are our future. But our future is problematic. We don't know what's going to happen. I think it's a perennial problem. And as you say, Jim, it takes the form at this moment in talking about the need for social order, for aristocracy, basically for a world in which people are unequal. But then you have the fundamental imperative, if you're going to have a legitimate regime that's going to survive, it has to have a broad public base. It has to be legitimate. The people have to believe in it. Combination of needing to control and discipline the military imperative that you see in the army in the war is matched with and in tension with a need to have buy-in from the mass of the people. How do you get people to believe in this thing? How do you get people in Washington's army to accept the discipline of the chain of command? Rob, this is all for you because you teach young military people all the time.
So I get nice chain of command segue. Thanks, Peter. As you were speaking, I was thinking about there are actually a number of really positive examples of members of the revolutionary generation doing what I think we would all agree was the right thing. And by the right thing, I mean doing things that didn't necessarily gain more power for themselves as individuals or as members of specific groups, but instead diffuse that power to others. The first thought that came to mind was a really exemplary individual named Haym Salomon, who was a Polish immigrant, arrived in New York City, worked with the resistance against the British, was captured for spying, escaped, ended up in Philadelphia. He became the assistant to Robert Morris, the superintendent of finance during the Revolution. And Salomon, who was himself a self-made man and independently wealthy, at several critical junctures bankrolled essentially the American Revolution. But he was Jewish. And as a Jew, he was not able in good conscience to even hold public office in the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's first constitution required that office holders take an oath affirming their belief in the Old and New Testament, and he couldn't in good conscience take that oath. And so he petitioned the government of Pennsylvania, and there was no immediate response. But a couple of years later, in the new Constitution, the oath was changed, and you just had to attest to your belief in, a divine system of rewards and punishments. So people are trying in many ways to be more inclusive. Or I think about, Peter's early work was all about the West and the way in which in the 1780s, these Eastern states, which after the Treaty of Paris now, have title to all of this land west of the Appalachian Mountains, which had been closed off to colonial settlement through the proclamation of 1763. Some of them have claims that stretch all the way across the continent. And yet, rather than trying to establish for themselves these transcontinental empires, and I'm from Connecticut, as is Peter, and we should note that Connecticut, you may think of it as a small state, but Connecticut skipped over Pennsylvania and then went through the Western Reserve of Ohio and basically followed Interstate 80 all the way through Reno and Sacramento, all the way to San Francisco. I mean, Connecticut had this continental empire, as did several other states. But they, resolved to give that up and to split that land west of the Appalachians into new states, first new territories, but new territories that would not be treated or mistreated as colonies, but would be admitted on an equal basis with the pre-existing states. So, we weren't going to treat them the way the British had treated us. And, speaking of mistreatment, of course, there's the issue of slavery. And we all know, that the founders did not succeed in eradicating slavery or defeating slavery. But it's notable that some members of this generation tried, and that during the American Revolution and in its immediate aftermath, you see all sorts of actions being taken. Vermont draws up a constitution in 1777 outlawing slavery. Massachusetts does away with slavery through a state Supreme Court decision in 1783. Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1784 institute plans for gradual emancipation. New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey will do so as well. So, I mean, it's kind of inspiring to see that this is a generation of people who not only want power for themselves, it's clear that they do, they don't want to be ruled, but they also have a good deal of self-restraint. And I think, we would all, when we think of self-restraint, think also of the great example of George Washington.
Okay, I'm checking the chat room. It's looking a little empty, but I'm ready with another question. This one may take us a little bit far afield, but hopefully not. It has to do with the matter of the people and democracy. I often think of Benjamin Rush, famous doctor in the Revolutionary era. And he wrote, he's sort of considered the father of the temperance movement, if not prohibition for that matter. And he wrote a pamphlet called Inquiry into the Use of Ardent Spirits. And he divides alcohol into, we got wine, we got beer, but we got the tough stuff, the alcohol, distilled spirits. Actually, it's placed a little bit, I guess, to the Whiskey Rebellion. But one of the concerns that he has is that how can you have a republic? And remember, at this point in time, only males, white males, free white adult males could primarily be the voters, except for New Jersey. I think New Jersey still had a few women voting at this point, but not long thereafter. And so my question is, he's not worried about how can you have a democracy when we have this increasing alcohol price? And basically, people in that era could drink us under the table. We could not compete in terms of absolute alcohol per consumption per capita. In terms of, we try, I'm sure many people do. My point is, or my question is not so much the point. He's worried that we have an alcoholic republic, to put it that way. People can't, the white males can't control themselves around alcohol. How can you have a democracy when their votes can be so easily bought with another round of ardent spirits? Was that a form of anxiety that you picked up? Or I'm trying to get to the social side a little bit of the issue. I didn't mean to stump you.
Well,
Peter, do you want to take that or should I?
No, I don't, but I'll step up as the sort of sacrifice that we expected from the revolutionaries. They expected from that was important. Yeah, no, Jim, when I lecture about the revolution, I start by talking about, before you get too excited about the founding fathers, let's talk about alcohol consumption. I'm with you. The notion that that the mob could be uncontrollable. It could be fueled by alcohol. That's a conventional wisdom of the day, and it's reasonable. It makes sense. In fact, reason is your key word. You know that the big emphasis of Rush and others was on education. That is, yes, the people potentially, this is the arc of history, you might say, the people will become capable of governing themselves, but they might not be right now. I think one way to think about the social and political history of the revolution is the various forms of socialization, of how do you commit people to a common cause, as they called it, discipline them. One, of course, way is by submitting to the discipline, military discipline, which is something that the kinds of sacrifices you make, they include submitting to that kind of discipline. But education, schools are important. By world standards, the Americans are the most literate people on the planet. And at the time of the American Revolution, they can, if they're literate, they can learn. They're also, drunk as they may usually be, and you're quite right, maybe 8 to 10 times the per capita intake of alcohol compared to us today. We do other things, of course, but they're also literate. They're also church going. They're by and large a seriously Christian people. And that sense of God's and their engagement, the God's engagement with their project, with the revolution, is very important. To get a full understanding of the revolution, you have to see how all these things work together. You could even say that the political party system that emerged despite the Constitution, despite the fact that the founders and the framers were hostile to political parties, which represented institutionalized conflict, but parties can be seen with the party press as being educational institutions, inculcating common principles and ideas. I think in many ways, because the revolution's emphasis is on freedom, liberation, democracy, equality, discipline, control, reason, and that faith in reason, the capacity of people to rise to their better selves, or what Lincoln called their better angels. I think it's all part of that pervasive fear. You would certainly know by living in any revolutionary American community what the possibilities for disorder, or what they would call then anarchy, were, and alcohol would be associated with that possibility. You really had to make a faith commitment to the improvability of human nature, to the possibilities, not to the existence of people who were now good and commonsensical necessarily, but that they could aspire to it. And the thing that might inspire them to aspire to it would be the vision of the kind of future that self-government would provide them. This all comes out of the fears they had from the revolution of the predatory imperial state taking from them. Well, okay, your property will be secure under this new regime. You will be free people. What are you going to do with it? Those are powerful questions, and yes, alcohol flows through all these questions. I agree with that. I don't think that's probably what you wanted to hear, but Rob, help me out.
Well, it's great that you mentioned education and religion. And I think, another thing that this generation had going for it that maybe helped it to combat some of the excesses of alcohol was political culture. And I was thinking about this great play that supposedly was George Washington's favorite play. It was written by Robert Munford in 1770. It's called The Candidates. And sort of the villain of the play is somebody who breaks the rules of political culture. He is a candidate for office, and his name, which I think is an alcohol reference, is Sir John Toddy. And he goes around glad-handing and grandstanding and making a bunch of principles, including to try to get the price of rum lowered. So he's trying to appeal to the people by making these quid pro quo promises. If you vote for me and give me power, I'll get the price of rum lowered for you. But there are other candidates, including one named Worthy and another named Woodby, and they sort of expose the fraudulence and the avarice and the Lust for Power of John Toddy. I hope I'm remembering the play correctly, but it's funny that it was George Washington's favorite play, and it's kind of not surprising that it was George Washington's favorite play. It's not surprising because, of course, George Washington was himself such a model of propriety, and Washington was the Cincinnatus who resigned his commission at the end of the American Revolution, gave up power and went back to his farm. He never openly sought office. He always acted as if it was a burden pressed upon him. He visibly followed all of the rules. But the fact that he enjoyed this play, and I can imagine him with other members of the House of Burgesses attending the play and laughing. They must have been laughing because this character, Sir John Toddy, he was a real character too, right? I mean, there were people like him. They didn't all follow the rules, but the fact that this culture existed, I think, acted as a nice way of restraining this generation.
I'm a little short on time here, so I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm turning it right over to Roger to give us the big wrap up. Thanks so very much. I really enjoyed your conversations and insights tonight, but Roger, it's yours.
Well, I want to thank everybody. I mean, this was absolutely remarkable in my way of thinking. I think everyone did. This was a great presentation. One of the things that we didn't really have here was an opportunity to see the book. So I wanted to, where did I put my copy of the book? There it is. I wanted to make sure that everyone sees a copy of the book and has if you can, I want to make sure that you see the copy of the book here. This is available at wherever books are sold, or I sent the link that you can purchase it on bookshop.org. And I also wanted to ask Joe Dooley to give us an update on the status of the SAR annual conference of the American Revolution, if you would.
I'd be happy to. Thank you very much. So I see that Holly Mayer is zoomed in, and Holly was the SAR Distinguished Scholar for the 2019 conference, the topic of which was Women Waging War. And I believe that she's working with the University of Virginia Press, and that the papers presented at that conference will hopefully, God bless, be published by UVA Press. The conference from 2020, thanks to COVID, has been delayed, and will actually, this June, we're going to have two conferences. They're going to have the 2020 conference and the 2021 conference. The 2020 conference will be led by Sean Scully at West Point, assisted by Rob McDonald, and the topic is Remembering Independence. It'll be a retrospective of how the Declaration of Independence has been used, understood, manipulated, parts of it emphasized, parts of it discounted, generation by generation. And then the 2021 conference will be on religion in the American Revolution. Rob mentioned Haim Solomon. I know that we're going to have at least one paper from an academic at Auburn University is presenting a paper on Jews in the American Revolution. That conference is going to be led by Catherine Carte at Southern Methodist University. It's going to be exciting. We're putting them all together. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe. And I will be posting the link for the SAR annual conference, the American Revolution, on the History Author Talks website.
Thank you.
You'll be able to find it past shows. You can also just go to sar.org and you'll find information there. For History Author Talks, I've got a great lineup coming up. I'm doing something I've never done before. I'm actually having one author, but present two of his books. So Norm Demaris, who's Professor Emeritus at Providence College up in Rhode Island, is going to be presenting his book, America's First Ally, and also, which obviously is about the French. And he's also going to be presenting his new book that's coming out, Washington's Engineer, about Louis Deportier, which is a fascinating biography. One of these guys that very few people have ever heard of. And I have to thank Bill Welsh, who is in our audience tonight, who gave me the idea for having Norm to write that book. And another show, I'm having Kevin Weddle, who's just published a book on Saratoga called The Complete Victory. And joining Kevin will be Doug Cubison, who wrote a few years ago, wrote Burgoyne and the Saratoga Campaign. So this is all of Burgoyne's papers. Jim, I might ask you to join me on that one too, for obvious reasons. Jim is a real expert on the Saratoga Campaign. And then at the end of the month, I have David O. Stewart, who just published his book on George Washington. And for any of you who have not yet had a chance to read David O. Stewart's new biography of George Washington, it is just terrific. I really enjoyed it. And David, we're going to be joined with Lindsay Chervinsky, who's going to be doing an encore presentation on her book, The Cabinet, which is about Washington's cabinet, which is also terrific. So we've got some terrific shows coming up on History Author Talks. My thanks, of course, to Jim Martin, who did a wonderful job as our guest host. I thank Joe Dooley for joining us this evening and telling us about the SAR and the SAR Annual Conference of the American Revolution. And of course, to our wonderful, distinguished author guests, Peter Onuf and Rob McDonald. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Roger.
Roger.
Good night.
Bye.